Kevin Rudd, delighted to have time with you today on the broad theme of Asia-Pacific strategy. Of course, you have a particular vantage point as an experienced Australian leader and policymaker at the highest levels and an expert and thinker on this vast region. Your thoughts will be valuable to many, so I'll take the opportunity of asking a couple of questions here. Before I ask a question, I should be clear on defining Asia-Pacific, which includes beginning in the West with Pakistan and, of course, India, across North Asia, including China, as far as Japan, all of Southeast Asia and Oceania, which includes Australia, New Zealand, and many Pacific islands. So this is a very vast region, and we're framing it as Asia-Pacific strategy lens. If you're ready, I could go to the first question.
Sounds good to me. I noticed Boise, Idaho is missing from that, but I'm happy to roll with the punches. Over to you.
Excellent. So security in Asia-Pacific has many different layers relating to many different contexts. One of the biggest questions relates to the future of Taiwan. Following the recent confirmation of Chinese Communist Party leaders, including Xi Jinping for at least the next 5 years, how might this change the security dynamics relating to Taiwan?
Well, it's a great question, and you're right to say that security policy dynamics across the Asia-Pacific region is a vast subject. It's almost a set of 21st century economies with a set of 19th century security policy tensions arising in the main, not exclusively, but in the main from unresolved territorial border questions. Of course, we are right to be preoccupied with the granddaddy of them all, which is the unresolved territorial question of China and Taiwan, because that lies at the fulcrum of US-China strategic tensions. But of course, if we look beneath that, we see unresolved maritime border questions in the South China Sea, unresolved maritime and terrestrial border questions in the East China Sea over Senkaku and Diaoyutai islands lying between China and Japan. We see the unresolved tensions in the Korean Peninsula, which have been festering since the ceasefire in 1953. And then going slightly west, we see the unresolved border tensions between India and China over the Sino-Indian border, and of course between India and Pakistan, Pakistan being China's long-standing strategic partner of choice in and around Kashmir. So it's one of those galvanizing and disturbing facts in global geopolitics that unresolved border issues provide the latent power to ignite broader sets of geopolitical tensions. Coming out of the 20th Party Congress, all I'd say is this: Xi Jinping has, I think, 2 or 3 core messages as it pertains to Taiwan. One, normally Party Congress reports over the last 20 to 30 years have had a set of standard phrases which assume that peace and stability are the dominant themes of our time. That's Chinese ideological code language for we don't see any major wars emerging, certainly not involving us, and therefore we can focus almost exclusively on the economy. For the first time in 20 to 30 years, those phrases have disappeared from the Party Congress report. And on top of that, we see new phrases from Xi Jinping as General Secretary, pointing to the fact that China now faces an increasingly grave and serious external strategic environment, that China should be making preparations for dangers in peacetime and preparing also for the storm. And when you look at the particular language used in and around the People's Liberation Army, it calls for the People's Liberation Army to prepare for war. It calls for the People's Liberation Army's combat resources to be enhanced, its combat training to be enhanced. So you don't have to be a Rhodes Scholar to work out that these are changes in strategic tonality. The specific language on Taiwan itself is relatively moderate, but the broader language on the international environment and on the PLA in particular carries with it, I think, a much more serious and concerning set of overturns for the medium-term future. Back to you.
Thanks very much. A follow-up point on this is that given action by the United States on access to China for semiconductors, and Taiwan is in the middle of this, is a tech war not already emerging, particularly in race for superiority in supercomputing and artificial intelligence?
I think your question is well founded. If there was any doubt at a level of analysis on this question prior to the 7th of October this year, then the events of the 7th of October, when the United States announced its new policy document, effectively banning high technology exports from the United States to China, is really the formal starting gun of a full-blown technology war between the two sides. We've had earlier rounds of this in terms of the debate over Huawei and 5G between the United States and its allies on the one hand, and between the United States and China on the other. And that, of course, evolved over the 4 to 5 years of the Trump administration and early Biden administration. But if that was the entree, the main course is now with us in the far more determinative technologies of semiconductors. So the open analytical question is, will this reset of American strategic policy on high technology and the full development of US industrial policy in support of its own semiconductor sector through the CHIPS Act, will it work? Will it impede China's semiconductor development? Or will it impede the American semiconductor development? Open questions, but the clear resolve of the US administration in the announcement of the 7 October set of measures, I think leaves us in no doubt whatsoever that whatever decoupling may be occurring between the US and China broadly on the economy, in trade, in foreign direct investment flows, in broader financial market engagement, on the technology front, the war is now well and truly on.
Thank you. Let me broaden out the next question a little bit to more countries in the region. Trade has been a success story for many in the Asia-Pacific region, for sure. Now, with the push on reshoring or even friendshoring, will that create momentum for economic or political blocs to form? And is it clear how friends would likely be defined? Is it more based on economic kind of relationships or potential, or more on democratic principles, in your view?
Well, forms of decoupling represented in forms of technology separation, trade conditionalities driven by supply chain concerns, and therefore foreign direct investment flows underpinning where manufacturing capabilities are located. These trends have been unfolding now for some time. My prediction is that following the 20th Party Congress in China, you're likely to see an intensification of these trends. We've already seen how financial markets have responded both to the policy content and personnel decisions of the 20th Party Congress. I think that's likely to continue. So therefore, the first part of your question about the unfolding dimensions of this, I think, is well-founded. In terms of how then this would be translated into reality, in terms of friendshoring, reshoring, offshoring, China plus one shoring or no shoring, this is a work in progress, which the corporate world, or should I say the corporate American and global corporates more broadly, are now wrestling with in all their boardrooms right now. I think it's fair to say that the deepening concerns about macroeconomic risk in the Chinese domestic market, that is, challenges to growth because of ideological factors on the home front, plus the geopolitical concerns about supply chain resilience between Chinese manufactured goods and the rest of the assembly processes around the world. These two factors are now driving corporate decision-making. In terms of where, therefore, corporates land, there seem to be three zones of economic opportunity. Broadly, Southeast Asia, led by the darling of the international investment community, the ironically entitled Socialist Republic of Vietnam, but more broadly in Southeast Asia. Secondly, India, as the Modi government seeks to make hay while the sun shines, mindful that there is geopolitical risk now accumulating to China. And then thirdly, Mexico, much closer to the United States, and of course, already part of the original NAFTA grouping of economies. I think that's where it's headed, but in terms of the precise definitions of friendshoring, this will be, I think, a mobile feast, although it could bring into sharp relief, for example, the significance of the Quad group of Japan, India, and Australia and the United States on the one hand, and of course the NATO economies in Europe.
Thank you. As you say, this is very much unfolding now in corporate boardrooms, and I imagine in a number of national capitals as well in the region as they try to parse how this is likely to play out. I'll move on to the last question here then, now that I have, which is, given the dynamics and parameters that you've talked about here, how do countries like Australia or Canada carve out, and I recognize there's a lot of differences between those countries, but let's say they're similar sized, how do they carve out a strategy for partnership, be it economic or otherwise, with different countries in Asia Pacific?
I think both Canberra and Ottawa will need to be mindful, as I think they are, of the, let's call it, surrounding geopolitical and geoeconomic trend, which is around at this stage one level or another of decoupling, whether it's decoupling with Chinese characteristics as China seeks to secure its own global supply chains and make them resilient against future crises, as well as US-driven types of decoupling, such as we've discussed in this program around semiconductors and technology plus. So that's the surrounding terrain, whether we like it or not. So, but it's not restricted to technology. It's also relevant to energy. It's also relevant to raw materials. It's also relevant to a range of other critical service industries. So my analysis would be, if you're sitting in Canberra and sitting in Ottawa, it will be to form a strategic view of the likely trajectory of US strategic thinking on these questions. And that now is relatively clear following the National Security Strategy of the United States released last month, the new National Defense Strategy, plus the new technology export bans announced on the 7th of October. Therefore, given where those documents are pointed, for countries like Canada and Australia, it is looking, I think, for new strategic opportunities ourselves in the areas that I referred to before. That is across wider Southeast Asia, across the rest of Northeast Asia, including Japan and the Republic of Korea, certainly in terms of India and South Asia, also with a particular lens, if you're from a Canadian perspective, on Mexico, given your own free trade arrangements through NAFTA plus. And also, I think what you're going to find increasingly is a predisposition for our friends in Europe, which collectively still represents the European Union, the largest economic grouping in the world. Europe, again, assuming a new significance in global supply chains for the economies of Canada and Australia. So I think it will be therefore a question of our governments working closely with our leading corporates, mindful of the strategic direction, but looking at the opportunities in each of those sub-markets around the world.
Thank you. Just a short follow-up point on this. You mentioned the U.S. National Security Strategy, which recently came out. I was struck by how focused that document is as well. It talks less about multilateralism and more about plurilateral arrangements or bilateral arrangements. What's your sense of the multilateral options ahead? Are these tools that will work well, or is it pushing more towards bilateral and plurilateral alternatives?
Well, I know that the mood always in Ottawa, and certainly depending on whether we've got a conservative or progressive government in Canberra, is always towards finding multilateral responses to outstanding global security, economic and climate change challenges for the global commons. And we should not throw the baby out with the bathwater. But the bottom line is this: the central machinery for dealing with global national security challenges or global security challenges or threats to peace and security is the UN Security Council. We currently have on it the Russian Federation abusing its veto power around its own invasion of a sovereign member state of the United Nations system. By virtue of the presence of the Russian veto power, it renders almost redundant the UN Security Council as a vehicle for action. Doesn't preclude the UN Security Council from its ability to produce normative statements, albeit with continued Russian and to some extent Chinese dissent. But on the core questions of war and peace, because you've got a non-compliant P5 member in the case of Russia, that's what determines the redundancy of the UN in the current circumstances. But at a broader normative level, the fact that we now have each of these contested Security Council resolutions finding their way into the UN General Assembly by way of motions to test the normative mood of the international community, this is actually a useful mechanism because it's been particularly confronting for both Moscow and Beijing to see large numbers of states with whom they assumed they had benign relationships rallying to the cause of a series of UN General Assembly resolutions opposed to Russia's unilateral invasion of Ukraine. And beyond the national security space, we should be very mindful of the fact that when it comes to climate change, there is no alternative to a combination of both national and multilateral action through the UNFCCC. And if there's one requirement we should have for the world's remaining superpowers, it's that whatever the geostrategic contest is, space must still be provided, political and diplomatic, for the UNFCCC to continue to do its work effectively. And climate change action is not a respecter of classical geopolitical divides. The planet at the end of the day doesn't lie and doesn't give a damn whether the emissions come out of North America, whether they come out of Europe, or whether they come out of China, or whether they come out of Russia.
Well, thank you for ending on the global commons point, which I think is fundamental. Thank you very much for your time here today in discussing these issues.
Good to be with you and for all of our friends in Canada. And let's work together on these global challenges with one heart and one mind.